This would be the business transformation is going to be have the most potential impact. If businesses just decide, I don't need to pay for $25,000, 25,000 square feet of space. I don't need it. They worked from home for 4 months. It was fine. That could be a problem. And the other factors, I think, are aggravating factors. Also, sorry, one more aggravating factor. The main attractions for New York City. Well, why do you pay a high rent? Why do you pay the income tax surcharge? Greatest restaurants in the world. Greatest cultural institutions in the world. I love Broadway. All right, but those things are not operating now. So that's an element.
You mentioned the prison system. You failed to mention that the state's only tested 10% of inmates across the board, and among all inmates, not just 55 and above, the infection rate, I believe, was about 10%, as opposed 10 to 15%, as opposed to that's according to the data on your website on July 10th. So I'm curious if there's any plans to increase testing among inmates, and if that's something that is ongoing, and if you'll release any further information. The most recent data is from July 10th on that.
Yeah, let's just make sure we're talking apples and apples. The earlier test we did was an antibody test. The antibody test says, did you have the COVID virus in the past? That was that 10%? Does anybody remember? Well, whatever it was about 10%. This test is what's called the diagnostic test, snapshot. Today, this is what the infection rate is. We tested the 55 and over asymptomatic. We test anybody who's symptomatic. Asymptomatic 55 and over, just on the theory of, well, these people are in a vulnerable class. Let's see what is the percentage who are infected now but are asymptomatic. And those are the numbers we saw today. Is that right, Tony?
Do you have that number for the overall population, or no, as of today?
What number? Go ahead, Melissa.
No, I just wanted to make clear. So all along, we tested prisoners by the same standard as we tested people outside of prisons, right? So if you had come into contact with someone who was known to have coronavirus, if you were symptomatic, then you got a coronavirus test, and then you either were hospitalized if that was necessary, or you were quarantined off, and you were then monitored as the virus progressed. So prisoners through the entire length of coronavirus were treated the exact same way as the general population. What the governor asked the docs to do, which they did, was every single prisoner who was 55 and over, regardless of whether or not they had been in contact with someone who had coronavirus, and all these people were asymptomatic, because if they were symptomatic, they were already being tested. Just blanket test every single person, so we know. So we have a gut check what's going on in the prison system, make sure that what we believed to be the case was actually the case, and that there hadn't been any outbreaks within the New York State corrections facilities. So we just did a blanket, every single person 55 and over. The website actually hasn't been updated with those results. It's going to be updated immediately following this press conference. And what we found, which was really great news, is that there had been no outbreak, and that the 55 and older population, it was 1.9% for positives, and then those people were appropriately either taken to the hospital if that was necessary, although in this instance, and Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, because they were all asymptomatic, I don't think that was necessary, or they were then quarantined, and they've been monitored.
I'll tell you why we did it. There have been, if you have trouble sleeping at night and you watch many hours of news programming, which is an affliction, double affliction that I have, you have had outbreaks across the country in prisons that have been quite significant. Think about it. In some ways, it's worse than any other congregate facility, right? Because people are really on top of one another, more than in OPWDD facility, more than in a nursing home. So you've had prisons that have had serious outbreaks. And that's when we decided to go just test everybody, 55 and over, even if you are asymptomatic.
Governor, I want to
Peter?
ask you about unemployment. We've heard from people who still for months cannot get through. They call from 8 o'clock in the morning to the end of the day. They send an email, they get a reply, which says call. And they just still cannot get through
Okay.
since April.
First of all, I get the overall situation. This is not a New York situation. It's all across the country. Remember what the federal government did is they passed a new unemployment law with new requirements, new regulations. They then gave it to the states and said, administer it. I talk to governors all day long. You look at how New York has handled this versus the other states. We have done a markedly better job than any state, even with a much higher number. You look at the number of people who have not yet gotten their check compared to any other state, we've done markedly better. Now, I know, at the same time, if you're the one who's waiting for your check, it's a problem. The people you are hearing from are not generally people who are the run-of-the-mill application. There are a lot of applications that are problematic. Not everybody gets a check. You have to meet certain federal requirements. Your income, your situation, your bank account. And we wind up with a lot of people who file, and then there's an issue. And look, you also have a real situation at the same time going on where you've had some massive frauds that have been going on. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Because you put a big pot of cash out there and you say call and get your check. You're seeing scams all across the country. So we're working to accelerate the checks getting out the door, but I have a little voice in my head that says, beware when the pendulum comes back and there's an audit afterwards that says New York State gave out checks to people who shouldn't have gotten the money, which is inevitable. And then I'm going to say, well, we were rushing to move the checks very quickly because we wanted to get money out to people. And everyone in this room is going to say, but you should have never given a check to a person who didn't deserve the check. You should have audited them first. And you're going to be right. But let me give you Melissa has the numbers, but I just wanted to give you a little context.
So the way that we calculate this is we look at claims that are 3 weeks or older, because on a sunny day in July when the economy is running perfectly, it takes DOL about 2 to 3 weeks to process a claim and get money out the door. So as of this morning, there are 1,259 claims that are 3 weeks or older. So any claim right now other than 1,259 are within the 3 weeks that on a sunny day in July when the economy is humming would take to turn over. On the issue of the phones, I actually had thought that the system had greatly improved, and I would like to follow up with you afterwards to hear from your hearing from and see if there's something specific we can do to address that.
How many people have we processed?
3.2 million people have gotten $34.4 billion since the start of this.
And Peter, of those 1,200, there are going to be issues with people. It's not everybody who asks for a check gets a check.
So people who are dialing their phone all day, every day, can finally get through to somebody and say, hey, what's going on with my claim?
That is, Kelly, do you know?
The call center, the calls actually have improved a lot. There was a glitch on Sunday night with some of the PUA claims, and it caused many people just this week to call. That was resolved, and people are now getting paid, but that caused a little bit. It was basically a technical error, but it has been resolved. So that there was an uptick this week.
This is not just this week. This is 2 weeks worth, call after call after call, nothing.
To me, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah,
We
especially
brought
because
in-
the numbers are
Yeah.
down so low.
We brought in
Google
Google to do a website. We hired 3,000 people, 3,000 to work the phones and the website. It's the volume was that incredibly high. And you have to check the financial information for every person. If you only have 1,200, how many were processed?
There's 1,259 that are older than 3 weeks.
1,200 older than 3 weeks. And how many processed total?
3.2 million.
3.2 million processed. 1,200 over 3 weeks. And then what percent of those have issues that have to be worked out? Or, by the way, out of 3 million, what percent is the fraud going to be?
Governor, we continue to hear from person after person about testing results taking more than a week. It happened to me, for example. And I know you've talked about the difference between the state and city labs and the national labs, but it's still perplexing for a lot of people to hear that, you know, the average turnaround is 2 to 3 days when they're waiting sometimes up to 14 days. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the discrepancy. Have you seen the average time gotten worse in the past few weeks since we last talked about that? And if there's anything else the state can do to speed up test results?
Here are the facts. The testing, amount of time to get back a test is going up across the country. Period. Why? Because the national laboratories that do nationwide testing, Quest, LabCorp, BioReference, etc., they are getting overwhelmed with all these states who are now going to the national labs. Caveat: why aren't the states developing their own labs in-state? We have 200 labs in-state. They should be doing that rather than just going to the national labs. True, but that's more complicated. In New York, about 70% of the tests are done by national labs. There is no delay in that 70% of labs because we appropriate the tests among those labs depending on their volume. So if one lab is getting slow, we have 200 labs in the queue we can allocate among the 200. About 30% of our tests are done by national labs. That 30% is getting longer. It is, because it's running into the national backlog. Not a New York State backlog, but a national backlog. So 70% of the tests, no issue. 30% of the tests that were going to the national labs, they have slowed down because the national labs have slowed down. And the federal government is working on supply chain issues for the national labs, which is part of it. The states nationally have to do a better job of using their local labs to increase capacity. But that is going on. And Gareth can give you some specific numbers. Here's what's worse. What's worse is it's going to get worse because you're going to come into flu season. And right now, we have basically said to all the labs in this state, work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day doing COVID tests. And they are. Come flu season, that's their busy season. And they're going to start to say, we have to run flu tests also. The flu tests, we fear, we're trying to figure a way around this, but we don't have one right now. The flu tests will eat at the capacity for the COVID tests. That's compounding this fear of a second wave in the fall. But Gareth?
If you look at how testing works in New York, we have about now over 800 testing sites. These are not labs, these are testing sites where if you want to get tested for COVID, you'd go there, sign up for an appointment, and they would swab your nose. And then each of those sites has to then pick a lab where they would send that specimen. So as the governor said, about over 70% of testing, those aren't going to the labs that have what you're seeing longer delays with. For example, we had about 69,000 tests yesterday. More than 50,000 of those did not go to the labs that are seeing long delays. And of those over 50,000, the average delay was about 2.6 days. The median is about 2 days. So yes, while you are getting those reports, and it's obviously any lag is not desirable, the majority of testing is in New York is happening on a much shorter time frame, which most other states right now can't say, and that's because of the work the governor did and to develop this huge network of labs here in the state that are doing that kind of testing.
But Luis, those are your numbers. Let me just make sure I heard them right. We did 69,000 tests. Of the 69,000, 50,000 had a 2.6 day turnaround. 9,000 were longer, whatever that was. But 50 of the,
The other 20,000, 30,000, how long did that take?
well, it's 50 to 69, so the other 19, right?
The other 19,000, you're seeing between 6 and 10 delays, 6 to 10 day average delays. Now, you'll sometimes have longer than that. Sometimes you'll have shorter than that. The labs also can prioritize what kind of samples are coming in. If it's someone who is symptomatic, of course, there's testing required before people have elective surgeries. They can prioritize those as well. But again, the ideal form of testing is this rapid result, point of care testing. You get the result very quickly. Until we have that on a mass scale, we're always going to have to rely on a system where you're sending to labs. And the key here is that every state needs to do what New York has done and develop this internal network of labs. We have some labs that do 10 tests a day. We have some labs that do thousands of tests a day on sometimes less than 1 day turnarounds. And if you had that on a nationwide scale, it would take off the pressure on these large national labs, and you'd see much better turnaround times across the entire country.
This is, just to make it a little more complicated for you, this is the tension between the federal government and the states on testing. You know, when they say, the federal government will say, the states have to do a better job, states say, we need more help from the federal government. It's true on both ends. Some of the national labs say our problem is a supply chain, and a lot of their supplies come from China. They need the federal government to help them with the supply chain. The federal government says to the states, you can't all be going to national labs. There are only 10 big national labs. You can't have the entire nation going to the 10 labs. States, you have to use the smaller labs in your states also, which is harder for a state to do, right? Go organize 200 labs. Each lab is small. You're only getting 400 tests here, 400 tests here. It's hard to do. It's a lot easier for a state just to say, I'm going to contract with National Lab, and that's it. So it's both ends of the equation.
Governor, can you detail how the state police and the SLA are stepping up enforcement in terms of social distancing and gatherings? And also, a lot of these gatherings are not at bars and restaurants, so what do we do about that? Also, where is that PSA going to be running where young people are actually going to see it?
We're going to run it in New York State. We're going to make it available to the Ad Council, which runs the ad nationwide.
But I mean, like, in terms of social media, I mean, you know,
Oh, you asking me
kids, like, where they can,
what
you know,
stations that
yeah,
they,
I mean,
what TV
because a lot of
social
them-
young people?
Is
Well,
it
I know,
gonna be
because
more
I
on
watch
social
that. That's
media?
what I watch. I watch the young people, because I'm like a 21 to 30 in terms of orientation. Do you know?
Because we are targeting it at 20 and 30 years old, as I'm sure you can imagine, we're going to be doing a big social media push. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and a lot of the news sites that we know are heavily trafficked by the 20 and 30-year-olds.
I relate to the 20, 30-year-olds. I do. I'm like, culturally, I'm there.
Also, how is the SLA and state police stepping up the enforcement? of these
SLA,
gatherings?
this is not
And especially the ones, I mean, no, SLA can't be involved in the ones that are not at bars and restaurants, which has also been a problem.
Yeah, the main problem, yes, you're right, there's a lot of elements to the problem. House parties, right? July 4th party in Albany, 30 positives. The main problem are bars, restaurants, because 21 to 30, you don't just have a gathering on a street corner and do bird watching. Alcohol is often involved. The alcohol has to come from a bar or a restaurant. That's why the overwhelming majority are in connection with a bar or a restaurant. Not to belabor this, in New York State, we have one license for a bar and a restaurant. We don't have a separate bar license and a restaurant license. Most other states have two licenses. one for a bar, one for a restaurant. When they opened outdoor dining, they opened just the restaurant licenses. None of them, very few, opened bars, okay? The president now says young people don't go into bars, right? Most states did not open bars. Since we only have one license, we reopened bars and restaurants. But it was for outdoor dining. It was not for outdoor drinking. Bars that are now serving outdoor drinking, that was never legal. There was no bar license that allowed you to have a block party in front of the bar. That was never allowed. And this question of, well, food with the alcohol. Any bar, by our current law, existing law, let's call it that, any bar had to have food available. There is no bar that only serves alcohol. To be a bar, you had to have food available. Soups, sandwiches, etc. More than just hors d'oeuvres, chicken wings. You had to have some substantive food. The lowest level of substantive food were sandwiches. Even to be a bar, you had to have food available. We opened outdoor dining. Dining is you go with your friends, you sit at a table, you stay at the table, and you only connect with those people at the table, and the other table is socially distanced. What they have done with outdoor drinking, you don't sit at a table and drink. You mingle, you move, you say hello, you hobnob. That was never what outdoor dining was. So the SLA and the state police will focus on the licensed entity by the state liquor authority, the bar or the restaurant holder. And we are going to be aggressive about enforcement. Having said that, the state liquor authority and the state police cannot police the entire state. I don't know how many thousands of bars we have. We need the local government to do it. We need the NYPD. We need the Nassau Police. We need the Suffolk Police in the Hamptons. We need the Erie County Police. We need the Albany Police to do their job. Yes, go ahead.
Regarding the new, thank you, Governor. Regarding the new restrictions put out by your administration yesterday, mandating that bars and restaurants may only serve food, a person, for example, can buy a $1 hot dog and not eat it, but just, buy it just so they can hang around and drink. Are these rules actually effective?
Well, there's a number of laws here. One of the laws is called the Open Container Law. You can't drink an alcoholic beverage on the sidewalk. Forget the SLA law. You can't drink an alcoholic beverage on the sidewalk. Zach violates it all the time. But it is illegal. So there are laws to enforce besides the SLA food law. But everybody knew what the difference between dining and drinking, right? It's a fundamental difference. Who didn't ask a question?
Governor, regarding the elections, the upcoming elections, when do you plan on detailing what the states will do to ensure all absentee ballots are counted and safe?
We are going to learn lessons from this last election. COVID has forced us to rapidly transition to all these new systems. You close down schools. We had to rapidly transition to remote learning. And frankly, the system wasn't perfected. And you see all these issues pop up. You couldn't walk into a hospital. We had to deploy to telemedicine. You saw all these issues pop up. You can't vote at a voting booth anymore. You can't be online. Everything by mail. And you hyper-energize that system to do the transition. And you see a lot of issues pop up. So we're going to study those issues, see how we can make it better. And then there's a whole electoral time clock by when ballots have to be mailed, et cetera. But I want these boards of elections to first learn some lessons from all the things that went wrong and take some time to correct them before we do it again.
Follow-up question?
Good. Last question.
Governor, I have a follow-up question.
And I don't mean to be...
Follow-up, important, really. You gotta
Okay,
take it.
Governor, can I just ask about, because I know what you said about the bars and restaurants for the last week, but I think there's still some confusion out there. A block down from me on 57th Street, there's a bar. They have tables, nice partitions in between. You order a scotch and soda. They come and they bring a scotch and soda to you on your table and they sit down. What you're saying now is that's illegal?
No. That is outdoor. We facilitated outdoor service for bars and restaurants. There was no outdoor bar service really, right? We expanded that greatly to deal with these issues of people want to socialize and the restaurants were dying. Any bar has by the current license, they must serve food. You go to the bar, you sit down at a table, you look at the menu, you order your scotch and soda, and you order what they had to have on the menu, soup, salad, etc. Fine. That's fine.
Okay, but they don't have a menu for food, so they're illegal.
No, they do.
Well,
They must, by their license, have food available. They must. Even a bar, the old corner bar that Zach used to go to. By a bar license, you have to have food available. By a bar license. There is no bar that can just serve alcohol. Going back, follow-up question for Ms. Kramer, because you can't say no.
It's on.
I can't say no. You can
It's
say
on,
no.
you can say no, but.
Yeah, but then
you
you know
have
what
to deal with
happens.
me, so
Yeah, I know.
anyway. It's on graffiti. There's been a huge increase in graffiti in New York City, not just on public buildings, but everywhere. You go into every neighborhood, there's graffiti everywhere. New York City zeroed out the dollars to clean up the graffiti on private buildings. There's $0 for it. Plus, 311 has decided to stop taking any complaints about graffiti. How is that a good idea, and how is that going to make the city come back?
Look, I mentioned it in my presentation, right? So I raised the issue before you raised it with me in your follow-up question, just from time.
A legitimate follow-up.
Yeah, it's got to be clean. It's graffiti. We've handled these issues before. Graffiti is not COVID. It's not. It's spray paint on a building. We've had it for many years. We had it on trains. We had it on buildings. We had it on walls. You enforce the law. It's illegal to do graffiti. Enforce the law. And when you miss it, clean it up and take it off, like we used to do.
How do you clean it up?
Well, look, there's money to do what you need to do. And graffiti sounds like a little thing. It's another sign of decay. And what we're trying to do is say to people, New Yorkers on the way back, New York did a great thing in handling COVID. You look at our numbers compared to everywhere else, nobody did what New Yorkers did. And New York City is coming back better than ever before. We understand the challenges. And people need to see that progress. They certainly don't need to see deterioration. And graffiti is something we can handle. We're not talking about curing COVID. Get the graffiti off the building. Detergent, power washer, brush, get the graffiti off the building.
The mayor to spend the money on graffiti.
I'm telling the mayor, the cleaning up the city is important. You have a lot of negativity in the air now. Positive, progress, move forward. Thank you, guys. I'll see you again. I'm not going anywhere. Always a pleasure, always a pleasure. That's a legislative change that has to be made by the legislature. I would support the legislative change. What's wrong with,
Cuomo chips?
Why is
What's
it
wrong
better
with
to
Cuomo
order
chips?
a
Yeah,
hot dog
what's wrong
versus
with
a Cuomo chip?
Don't you like Cuomo chips?
First of all, how did I get associated with chips? I don't know. There's nothing wrong with Cuomo chips. I enjoy them. They do not suffice in the existing law as a bar serving food. This is a law going back to the old days. The bar had to have food available, soups, sandwiches, even Cuomo chips were not enough. Thank you, guys.